Hi, everyone. Good morning and welcome to the Wilson Center. My name is Faria Nasruddin. I'm a program associate with the Middle East program here today. I am pleased to welcome you to the Melting Point, High Command and War in the 21st Century, a talk with General Kenneth F. McKenzie. To introduce today's event and welcome today's speakers, I'm pleased to introduce the President and CEO of the Wilson Center, Ambassador Mark Green.
Thanks, Faria. Welcome to today's discussion with General McKenzie, best known as the former commander of the U.S. Central Command. General McKenzie's important new book is The Melting Pot, as you heard. General, I wish the topics in your book were ancient history or fantasy or science fiction. Sadly, in reality, what you saw, did, and learned has never been more relevant to the choices that we have before us in the Middle East. For those joining the Wilson Center the first time, we are a unique institution in foreign policy. Wilson is congressionally chartered, scholarship-driven, and most importantly, fiercely nonpartisan and independent. As we approach the anniversary of the horrific October 7th Hamas attack in Israel, we see turbulent, tumultuous times in the region. To be clear, every day that goes by is a bad day. Hostages are still being held by Hamas, including Americans. Millions have been displaced, and millions are in need of humanitarian assistance. And of course, the conflict has now expanded on Israel's northern front into Lebanon. It's all a brutal reminder of the dark role that Iran plays in the region and how its so-called axis of resistance is a direct threat to the U.S. and our key allies. And what this also means is that I'm not only honored to introduce our distinguished speaker today, but eager to listen to him and take notes. General McKenzie served our country as a member of the Marine Corps for 42 years, including 3 as CENTCOM commander, which is where I encountered him. In this role, General McKenzie oversaw some of the most important and sometimes controversial operations in modern U.S. military history. Among them were the strikes on Qassem Soleimani and 2 successive leaders of ISIS, many months of deterrence operations against Iran and its proxies, and a methodical drawdown in Iraq. He also directed the non-combatant evacuation operation and final withdrawal from Afghanistan. He's now executive director of the University of South Florida's Global and National Security Institute and executive director of the Florida Center for Cybersecurity, also known as Cyber Florida. I now give the floor over to Merissa Khurma, the director of Wilson Center's Middle East program. Merissa, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Green, and welcome, General McKenzie. It's a pleasure to host you here at the Wilson Center. I also want to welcome all of our audience online. We always have over 300 people watching, so just a reminder to all of you online also that as we go along, you can submit your questions in the comment section or send it to us via Twitter. This is such a timely discussion of the book that you put together, reflecting on your time, particularly at Central Command, and the themes that run through, I thought were fascinating, and I would love for you to tell us a little bit more because you talk about the relations between the civilian and the military. And in fact, even talk about the importance of the primacy of the civilian leadership. And I thought there was a very interesting story about the genesis of CENTCOM that very much ties into that theme. The importance of leadership, not just in the military, but as well as civilian leadership, and then the very unique role of a combatant commander. So I thought maybe you can start by telling us a little bit more about those central themes, and then we'll zoom into the Middle East.
Certainly. First of all, thanks for having me here. I look forward to the discussion today, and I particularly look forward to your questions. And thanks for that great introduction, Ambassador. Really appreciate that. The title of the book is The Melting Point, and it's taken from a line written by Barbara Tuchman from her great book about the beginning of the First World War, The Guns of August. And I think it's a book that is still relevant today. The book's still in print, and I would recommend it to you. But in her book, there's a line, that melting point of warfare, the temperament of the individual commander. And that always stuck with me. And when I had the opportunity to be a combatant commander, and I'll talk about what that means here in just a moment, when it was over, I wanted to write about my experiences and why were those experiences unique. And so I'll say this, as a combatant commander, you're one of 11 people, men and women, 4-star generals and 4-star admirals who really do the operations for the U.S. military. And it's important to understand what that means. 7 combatant commanders are geographic combatant commanders. They are responsible for a portion of the earth. In my case, that was Central Command, Egypt in the west, Pakistan in the east, Kazakhstan in the north to Yemen in the south, 21 countries, and became 21 countries in early 2021 when Israel entered the Central Command region, and we can talk about that more specifically here in just a little bit. But so there are 7 of these geographic combatant commanders. 4 are functional. They don't own ground, but they have functional global responsibilities. My neighbor down at Central in Tampa was Special Operations Command. There's Transportation Command, which moves stuff around as you would think. Space Command, Cyber Command. So these commands all do things globally, but they don't own ground. The people who actually cause things to happen are the geographic combatant commanders, and that's because you're in the chain of command. And when I was the Central Command commander, I worked for 2 people in the world. I worked for the President of the United States, and I worked for the Secretary of Defense. Nobody else could give me an order, and so that's a unique thing because that's a very short chain of command. You know exactly who your boss is, and it also is unique in that as a combatant commander, you have the opportunity to give advice. You are a junior partner, and appropriately so, in that dialogue, but you do get the opportunity to give advice to the people that are actually going to make the decisions. And there are not a lot of those people that are making decisions above you. So there's an opportunity to do that, and that differs from, say, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, C.Q. Brown, good friend of mine, his predecessor, Mark Milley, and then Joe Dunford. These are all old and good friends of mine. They are the nation's senior military officer. By law, custom, and tradition, they're the senior military advisor to the President and the Secretary of Defense, but they are not in the chain of command. And the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff cannot issue an order. He cannot cause a ship to sail, a bomb to drop, an airplane to take off, a missile to launch. He cannot do any of those things. And as you know, there are a lot of advisors around the President, around the Secretary, and those are key people, but they do not have responsibility for execution. That is uniquely the province of the combatant commander, being in the chain of command. So it's a unique perspective. You're in the room when policy is made, sometimes. I was very lucky to be in the room with 2 presidents on a number of occasions. Had the opportunity to give advice. Sometimes that advice was taken, sometimes it wasn't, which is fine. And then I had the responsibility for execution. So that gives you a unique perspective, and that was the genesis why I wanted to write about it. And so that really was the intellectual seed that started the melting point. The other point I'd make is while we're on it, and thanks for emphasizing it, actually, Marissa, is the importance of the primacy of civilian control. I hope the theme is strong throughout the book because I believe in it fundamentally. It's very important that a president, any president, regardless of party, can make a decision, even if it's a wrong decision, even if it's a demonstrably wrong decision, and fully expect that order is going to be executed by the U.S. military. You don't get a vote in it unless the order is in a legal order. And a legal order is pretty clear. I never actually got a legal order in 42 years, 10 months of service. But while I was at CENTCOM, I had 14 lawyers on my staff happy to point out a legal order to me. I just never got one. But the fact of the matter is, as a combatant commander, you can find the order wrong, demonstrably wrong, analytically wrong, morally repugnant, distasteful, goes against your religious beliefs, anything you want to say, but you got to do it. And that is an important thing. The fact that the military is wholly subordinate to civilian authority, I would argue, is far more important than the character of any individual decision. Mm-hmm. And that's the point I would make. Because look, if people ask me every once in a while, well, why didn't you resign over Afghanistan? I never thought about it. I never ever thought about it because the President was within his rights to give that order. It was my responsibility to faithfully execute his desires to the best of our ability. My position on that operation is pretty clear, and we can talk about that if you'd like a little bit. Mm-hmm. But the thing is, had I resigned, no matter how you cast it, when a 4-star general quits, that's a political action. It's going to reverberate because a 4-star, you exist right up at the very top, that nexus of policy, strategy, statecraft, diplomacy, and also politics. It's a simple fact that, as Churchill said, the closer you get to the top, until you get to the very top, you understand that politics is in the room. To believe otherwise is to be naive. No U.S. president of either party can afford to ignore politics. And the example I always give is to sort of depersonalize it. I go back to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. In the spring of 1942, we're building up after the attack at Pearl Harbor. We're sending lots of forces to Europe. Essentially, the chairman, George Marshall, Chief of Staff of the Army, had very strong vision that we needed to put those forces in England to prepare for an early cross-channel attack into France, into the heart of Germany. That was U.S. strategic doctrine. Roosevelt, though, was convinced by Churchill instead to go and operate in North Africa. Marshall violently did not agree with this. They went back and forth. Books have been written on it. But finally, the president said, this is what we're going to do, General Marshall. And General Marshall saluted and did it. And the president said one other thing. I want that invasion to go before 7 November 1942. Mm-hmm. Why is that an important date? That's midterm elections. Mm-hmm. So, you know, when we talk about presidents making decisions with some political baggage, we should remember it's not new. It goes back to Lincoln and the U.S. Civil War as well. There are lots of examples we could all cite as we think about that. But nonetheless, that stuff functions at that level, and it's an important thing.
And of course, throughout the book, this theme emerges with the various tensions between civilian leadership and military leadership. But then, as you point out, this is a healthy conflict to have. To ensure that there is debate, especially with regards to a combatant commander, because you do give advice. I want to jump straight into the region because I think that we are at yet another critical inflection point. I think the worst-case scenario of all-out war that all of the regional leaders have been warning against, and the Biden administration has been working tirelessly as well to avert, is much closer today to us than it was before. And I want to start with Iran because, of course, you go through, detailed account of, your beliefs on Iran, the killing of Qassem Soleimani, who of course, was heading the Quds force, as well as other issues pertaining to Iran and Syria and Iraq and in Yemen. And one thing that struck me is what you wrote about deterrence with Iran, that it is achieved when Iranian leadership recognized that the potential goal they're pursuing was not worth the potential cost we could impose. So if you can tell us how this applies to the current situation.
Sure. So let me begin by saying, I've written the Washington Post this morning, as many of you did, and other newspapers were ever closer to a regional war. So actually, Israel's been hit by over 400 ballistic missiles in the last 4 or 5 months. I don't know what would distinguish it from regional war, actually, right now. I don't know what that's a definition we seem to keep pushing into the future. I would argue perhaps we're in a regional war today. And we just don't want to admit that, don't want to recognize it for whatever reason. So I just throw that out as an aside. Let me just talk about Iran for a minute. I think to understand Iran, and Americans have a very tough time, I think, thinking about Iran. We tend to think in the current. Iranians tend to think over the couple of 1,000-year history of their culture and their nation. And that puts us we're looking at it through a very different thing. Most Americans think our relationship with Iran began maybe in 1978, 79, when the Shah was overthrown, he fled to the United States. More perceptive Americans might remember 1953 when we deposed a sitting prime minister and put the Shah back on the throne. The Iranians certainly remember that. But more to the point, the Iranian culture is a proud imperial culture that goes back thousands of years. Alexander the Great fought Darius. I mean, the Persian Empire, there's a vast amount of history there. So we sometimes do ourselves a disservice when we focus just on the gang of theocratic thugs that are running Iran today. There's far more to Iran than that, but I think we oversimplify sometimes. So when I think about Iran, I think you need to understand what's important to them. The principal goal, in my view, of Iranian statecraft is preservation of the regime. They view themselves as a revolutionary regime that came to power overthrowing the Shah in the late 1970s. They know the history of revolutionary regimes is that as the revolutionary generation leaves the stage, often the revolution falls apart. They have the example of the French Revolution. They have the example of the Russian Revolution to take a look at and study there. They also understand that the first task of a revolutionary regime is to keep the revolution alive, to continue to export the revolutionary ideology, cast in theocratic tones in this sense in their Shia proxies. But nonetheless, that's their primary task, and they view that as the end-all, ultimately, of Iranian policy. Now, there are two other components there are lots of components of Iranian policy, but for our discussion today, I think there are two we're talking. The other two are destruction of the state of Israel. That's a fundamental cornerstone of Iranian belief. We should take them at their word when they say that. And the third one is ejection of the United States from the region. But here's the thing. Objectives 2 and 3 are never going to threaten maintenance of Objective 1. And if you understand that, then several things become a little clearer about Iranian behavior. And so when I think about what's Iran going to do, why did they take this action, then you can understand it when you look at that particular model. And that's why you can, in fact, gain deterrence against Iran. You have to be willing, though, to threaten Objective 1. And that will allow you to gain a form of leverage against them.
And with the killing of Soleimani, there were lots of, you wanted to make sure that you understood the repercussions. And how did that establish deterrence?
Sure. So, first of all, we took the strike on Qassem Soleimani because he posed an imminent danger to lives of Americans. There were strategic calculations, and we did think about the long term. But the fact of the matter was, had he not been struck and killed the day he was struck and killed, many Americans would likely have died, and other people in the region as well. I believed that the night of the strike. I believe it as I talk to you here today. The region is actually different and better because he's gone. So and the effect of that was the Iranians have always had a clear understanding of United States capabilities. They know what we can do. They're very clear-eyed about that. To not understand that is to misunderstand them. They know what we're capable of doing. What they always question is our will. And deterrence is also founded on demonstrated capability and demonstrated will to use that capability. Until the death of Qassem Soleimani, they were doubtful of that will. They had pushed us very hard in the years before. Qassem Soleimani had with explosively formed penetrators, killing hundreds of U.S. soldiers and Marines in Iraq. They could not find a red line that we weren't willing to let them cross. The strike on Soleimani caused them to sort of back up a little bit. But just here's the thing about this region. Deterrence has a short half-life. It's just the nature of the region. It has to be constantly revisited. It has to be revisited systemically if you want deterrence to remain. Nonetheless, there's an object lesson there. You do something you take away something that's very important to Iran, it is going to change their behavior. Now look, in the aftermath of Soleimani, they continued low-level strikes on Americans. I don't want to say that's going away. I call that contested deterrence. State-on-state deterrence achieved, low-level deterrence designed to push us out of the region, still there, but the Iranians were not willing to take a major move until very recently. And by that I'm talking about the massive attack on Israel on 13 April, which I would argue, and we can follow up on, has nothing to do with Gaza. It has nothing to do with Hamas. It has everything to do with the relationship between Israel and Iran.
And it was specifically in response to the assassination of their Revolutionary Guard commanders in Damascus.
It was specifically in regard to that strike. You're absolutely right. And that was the culmination of a couple of years of, more than that actually, in the shadow war that Israel and Iran fight around the region. Iran was being bested in that shadow war. They're nuclear scientists for a while. You know, a friend of mine used to say the most dangerous job in the world used to be a Chinese coal miner. Now it's being a nuclear scientist in Tehran, and because a lot of these people were being killed.
Yeah.
And so Iran, culminating in that 1 April strike, Iran took a page from the Russian playbook, escalate to de-escalate. You know, it's a game theory concept. If you're in a game and you don't like the way it's going, you radically raise the stakes under the contingent theory that your opponent will find it too rich and will back off. Problem is, it's from the Russian playbook, and they have nuclear weapons. So the Russians can play that card. They're playing it in Europe right now. But the Iranians actually, when they played the card, it was a pair of twos. And so it was an ineffective card, and they were exposed. And that is great. I would argue that strike on 13 April and the strike 2 days ago didn't help them any, has gravely weakened the centerpiece of Iranian deterrence. Let me grab one, talk about this for 1 second. So I am at a little bit of a variance than most people who say that the principle that Iran's crown jewels are possession of a nuclear weapon. I'm not actually sure Iran wants to possess a nuclear weapon. Iran wants to be able to possess a nuclear weapon, which means they want to be right at breakout, and they are right at breakout. They could cross this threshold within 2 weeks and have the fissile material is largely there. It's a question of semantics. But they know that once they cross that line, then they're never going to be able to cross it again. And the real problem that Iran faces is not a physics problem, it's an aeronautical engineering problem. If they get a weapon, it'll be what we'd call a test article, bigger than this table. They've got to weaponize that, turn it into a weapon, then build a rocket that will take it to, say, Tel Aviv, then build a reentry system that will allow it to survive the heat of entry into the atmosphere at theater range. That's a year or more to build. Now you're in that middle zone there where you've declared you've got it, but you don't have an effective way to deliver it. You got to test that weapon, not test the weapon, you've got to test the delivery system. So I would argue, look, I don't want to, and the Iranians could make a decision based on what's going on now to pursue a nuclear weapon, so things can change. But they could have gone nuclear 6 months ago, 9 months ago, a year ago. They haven't done it yet. And I think, again, it's because they can dangle it in front of us, gain concessions, because what they really need is money. And so they can work that opportunity. Iran's real crown jewels, I would argue, are its ballistic missile force, its drones, and its land attack cruise missiles. They have spent a lot of money over the last 15 or 20 years building up this force. They've got about 5,000 or so missiles of various range, many hundreds of which can actually hit Tel Aviv. And that's really the core of the Iranian deterrence system. And so that's available this afternoon. They launched it against Israel. They could launch it against their neighbors. I would argue when you think about Iranian deterrence and what Iran values, and I go back to a conversation President President-elect Biden, I want to say it was in December, had to be December 2020. It was either in the New Yorker or the Atlantic. I can't recall which, but he's talking. He said, look, we're going to try to do a new nuclear deal with Iran, and then we're going to talk about limiting their ballistic missiles and their other weapons. And the Iranian response was electric, and it didn't talk about the nuclear stuff. It said, we're never going to bargain away our missiles, which it was interesting because it tells you what's valued in the mind of the opponent.
That and their proxies are basically non-negotiable.
Non-negotiable.
In
You're
any
absolutely
in
right.
any
You are
talks
absolutely
moving
right.
forward.
Yep.
So one thing that also struck me is that you talked about how the Iranians don't really seek a war with the United States, an all-out war, or with their allies and partners. And of course, the post-October 7th, theater is very different. Because it also comes with a lot of the regional allies and partners of the United States normalizing relations with Iran. Just a few days ago, they were all, the GCC foreign ministers were in Doha and met with the Iranian president and members of the cabinet. And so can this be leveraged to de-escalate at this point of this regional conflict that, many people are watching, particularly waiting for an Israeli response?
Sure. So I'm not optimistic about that opportunity. Look, the Gulf states and probably UAE most prominently, they doubt American guarantees. They doubt that we'd be there for them if they get into trouble. They have vision for where they want to go in the future. They know that Iran can violently disrupt that by striking Dubai or Abu Dhabi or any one of a number of other of those beautiful cities there in the desert. So they do have outreach to Iran. Frankly, I would not overstate that. From where I sit, I think it's something that's going on. We certainly shouldn't discourage it, but I think Iranian objectives are still ultimately malign, and I think they're incompatible with what the Gulf states need for any kind of collective self-defense.
And then you said something very important, which you also talk about in your book, which is this perception in the region that the United States is disengaged and cannot necessarily be relied on. And then enter China, because you do talk about the Middle East being a key theater for great power competition, especially with regards to China's economic reach. How can that be addressed by this current administration or the next administration?
Sure. Well, I think, first of all, we almost dislocated our shoulder, patting ourselves on the back about how we were leaving the region to go to the Pacific. It was surprisingly maladroit, poorly messaged. It was an act almost of strategic incompetence, the way that we messaged that. There are ways that you can redistribute your forces, and we are a global power, and China is, I would agree, the pacing threat. There are ways you can do that without scaring your friends, and we chose to do none of those things. And so China has begun to move into the theater. Most of their embassies now, I believe all their embassies have a flag officer as their attaché. We have been systematically reducing our military presence at our embassies, which is very important in the Middle East, which is which are states that know and understand ceremony, pomp, circumstance, and mill-to-mill relations. We're drawing down, taking our generals and admirals back. That's soft power that we're just giving up there. Not smart. So I think in all those things, we just have not been adroit. I recognized as the CENTCOM commander that you have to be able to, clearly the Pacific is our point of emphasis, but as a global power, you have to recognize that you don't always fight right where the defenses are the thickest. In the Western Pacific. China has vulnerabilities and weakness. 52% of their hydrocarbons come through the Strait of Hormuz. If we ever wanted to pressure China, might it not be wiser to pressure them in the Strait of Hormuz than in, say, in the Straits of Malacca or even further into the region? We often get fixated on that. For a global power, we remain remarkably stovepiped and regional. And that's one of my principal criticisms of the security strategy approach the United States has adopted.
And you're arguing in your book that you can confront China and maintain a presence in the Middle East at the same time. What does that look like?
Well, I think one thing we have to recognize is that the joint force has got to be bigger than it is now. We've been sliding along on continuing resolutions, and actually the Department of Defense is funded under the rate of inflation. So that we're going to have to consider that. It doesn't need to be a huge increase, but it does need to be increased. And at the same time, we need to be more adroit in how we maneuver, how we display forces around the region, around the world, I should say, and less obvious crowing and messaging about everything's going to the Western Pacific. A lot of stuff's, the vast majority of U.S. military power is already in the Western Pacific, actually. But there are other things going on in the world. I mean, and of course, we haven't talked at all about Ukraine and Russia and Europe, and that's another significant thing that's a drain on U.S. resources right now. The joint force is strapped in ways that it hasn't been strapped in a long time right now.
So I want to give Ambassador Jeffrey the opportunity to also chime in with a question, and then I want to move forward with questions from the audience as well as from our online audience. So, Jim, over to you.
Thanks. It was a pleasure serving with General McKenzie. Some wild days, particularly the almost pullout of troops from Syria. Actually, there were a number, but we did the 2019 one, including an even wilder briefing along with Secretary Esper and the chairman to the entire U.S. Congress, trying to explain what the hell we were up to. But it's really a pleasure. First, a comment and a question. The comment is, I want to underline three things General McKenzie said that put into question much of the conventional wisdom in Washington, and we're hearing it now, on Iran and the region. The first is, you hear, well, Iran is ultimately a defensive country that is concerned with its own security. Now, that's exactly what General McKenzie said, and it's correct. But he also said that part of Iran's nature is this philosophical, ideological thing. It's central to them, which means it won't give it up. To quote Kissinger in other contexts, but of similar countries, if a country defines its security in such a broad way, everybody else's security is affected. So that's not an excuse for saying we can't deal with Iran. Secondly, the idea of, and we hear this all the time, I heard it all the time in government, as did you, well, a major war, or known also as conflagration, gets us to not do anything, including the famous red line in 2013, but there are many other examples that we both saw. And yet we are actually seeing regional war right now, and we've seen close to it before, and it doesn't necessarily need hundreds of thousands of U.S. troops fighting for decades. There are other ways to do it. The third thing is the nuclear program. I agree with you. I think, and again, I've seen this many times, the Iranians use things that only experts can track, like how many centrifuges, what degree are you enriching to this week, to get us to stop things, because the argument is made all over Washington. My God, they'll go to 62% enrichment from 58% or something like that. And, you've seen that. These are important. But here's my question. When you were a combatant commander, your colleague to the north in Europe had really one, call it campaign, call it conflict, call it problem, Russia. Your colleague to the east in the Pacific had two, Korea and China. You had three, Afghanistan, Iran, and ISIS. How did you organize yourself to deal with these from the standpoint of organization, priority, and did it change over time?
Well, Thanks, Ambassador, and it was wonderful working with you. One of the highlights of my career was our time together. We did have some good times and did some good. When I came into CENTCOM, I had the benefit of coming there from being the director of the Joint Staff, which is a great three-star job. You see and know everything. You're right at the center of everything that goes on up here. It's just a wonderful job, and there's no better preparation for going to a four-star command than being the director of the Joint Staff. So and before that, I'd commanded the Marines in Central Command, and I'd also been the J5 on the Joint Staff, the strategic planner, and I'd been the strategic planner at Central Command. So I knew the region, I knew the headquarters, I had a very strong idea, and you're right, Jim. So what had happened over time, when I was there 2010, 11, 12, we were focused on Iran because then General Mattis felt that was the primary threat in the region. We were prosecuting campaigns in Iraq and or pulling out of Iraq, I should say, during that period of time, and we were prosecuting a campaign in Afghanistan, but the focus of the headquarters was on Iran. Over time, that changed as the campaign in Afghanistan waxed and waned. And then, of course, ISIS came to power, and that took a lot of energy out of the headquarters from 2014 on as we put together a coalition to actually eventually squeeze and compress ISIS by the spring of 2019. So the headquarters was going several different ways. I felt very strongly that the main threat was Iran, and I wanted to organize the headquarters to fight Iran. And what you sometimes get in the habit of doing at CENTCOM is, you're used to managing, like I had a four-star general who worked for me that actually fought the war in Afghanistan, a great Army officer named Scott Miller, some of you may know him, had a task force in Iraq that was responsible for that. But I rejected the idea of standing up another component to confront Iran because it was a large nation state. If we fought Iran, it would not be a counterinsurgency war. It would be high-level sustained combat, and therefore it needed a joint force commander at a very high level and the resources of a four-star headquarters in order to be able to do that. So over the first 90, 120 days of my time, and I talk a little bit about it in the book, at Central Command, I didn't reorganize the headquarters, but what I did was I did away with certain things that I didn't feel were useful, and then I really emphasized the role of my generals and admirals, my flag officers, and their importance in it, because we'd gotten to a point where a lot of this stuff was done by little boutique organizations at a very high level of classification that dealt with Iran, that dealt with Israel, and so sometimes we classify so much no one has any idea what's going on. And I felt we needed to change that. So, by the summer of 2019, the headquarters was recast with a central focus on Iran. And we retained that focus till the day I left, and I believe my successor, General Eric Kurilla, who was my chief of staff my first year at CENTCOM, has maintained that same focus. You got to deal with the principal threat first. The principal threat in the region is Iran. Violent extremists are a problem, but a four-star headquarters can do lesser included stuff. But you've got the commander, the boss. One of the principal things you got to do is what's important to me, what's important to my headquarters, what am I going to focus on? So that was sort of the approach that we took, Jim. Thank you.
So one last question from me, because in your concluding chapter, you go back to Iran, and then you remind your readers that Iran's not going anywhere. It's going to stay in the region, and that it will weather the storm. Of course, right now it's in a much more intense storm than the pre-October 7th Middle East, and that we need to find a way to integrate it into the region in a way that serves U.S. purposes as well as theirs. What does that look like?
Well, it's easy to write, it's hard to do,
Yeah.
as you all know.
Of
But I
course.
would say this: Iran it's going to be a regional hegemon. It's not going away. It's not going to suddenly. We're not going to be able to. No maximum pressure campaign is going to cause the nation of Iran to go away. Now, leadership could potentially change, although I'm not optimistic about the current leadership changing right now. They've got a death grip on power. And we often in the United States, we see the protests in Iran, and we mirror image what we would like to be into Iran. Well, what we would like to be is not what's going on, and they will adopt genocidal measures to remain in power if they have to. And so I think in the short term, there's not a lot of opportunity for this. But we begin by realizing, I think the first thing to realize is they're not going to go away, because I still think that we dream of it, that we can wish this problem away. Once you learn to recognize that this is something you're going to have to deal with in deep time, not as simply a tactical problem, then new vistas can open up to you. But Iran would have to do some things would have to change in Iran too. And I don't mean necessarily the regime nature. They would have to make some decisions that they're probably not going to make right now. The fact of the matter is, we're in a kinetic phase right now, and there's going to be some fighting before there's any diplomacy at work here.
So behavior change rather than regime change.
I think that's the only reasonable thing we could hope for right now.
So we have questions coming in from the online audience. I want to start with one, and then we'll turn to our audience here. This question is from Andrew Plitt, who is at USAID. He's the Senior Department Assistant Administrator for the Middle East. Can you opine on the Israeli calculus as they degrade Hamas and Hezbollah and consider the post-conflict security environment for Israel? And at what point might their military actions be doing more to grow an insurgency and radicalize Arab populations than establish deterrence?
Sure. So today, let's actually start with a country that wasn't named. Let's start with Iran. Iran is in a corner today. They're in a corner because for many years, their principal leverage against Israel in the event of a major war was Hezbollah. Many people don't realize that, but let me just explain what I mean when I say that. Iran attacked Israel 2 nights ago with about 200 ballistic missiles. That's the maximum effort. They don't have the ability to fire any more at a time than they actually is 100 and then another 100, some combination. Yeah, but in 2 waves. Because, well, I said they've got, let's say for the sake of argument, 1,000 missiles that can reach Tel Aviv. They have to be put on tractor erector launchers, or TELs, is what we call them in my business. And they've got to be taken out of storage, taken to a launch site, erected if they're liquid fueled, and then fueled, because you can't fuel the stack till it's vertical. And then you launch it. So you can only launch so many. Iran can't do any more than they did 2 nights ago. It's not possible. They got a lot of shorter range missiles they can use against Saudi Arabia, UAE, and our bases in the region. But to get to Israel, it's a fairly small throughput. And you saw how easily Israeli defenses handled the April attack and then this attack. So hold that thought. But what Iran counted on was Lebanese Hezbollah. Over 150,000 missiles, depending on how you count it, many tens of thousands of which are capable missiles, accurate missiles capable of reaching well down to the metropolitan areas of Israel. So the logic was, if we get into trouble, LH could conceivably bail us out. And then you also open the possibility of a 2-axis attack on Israel, which is everybody's worst nightmare when it comes to defending yourself, having to defend on two separate fronts. Well, so what's happened to Lebanese Hezbollah is they have been decapitated. There's no leadership echelon that's visible to me. I'm sure they got people that are coming up. But those guys aren't exactly excited about talking on the phones or meeting because they're going to be struck by Israel when they are. Israel has demonstrated dazzling technological dominance in Lebanon, and it continues. And these strikes are going to continue. So at the same time, they've taken out the military command echelon, the political echelon. They've also, and this has not gotten as much coverage, they have systematically reduced the stocks of weapons that Hezbollah has. Hezbollah is not the force they were 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, a month ago. And so that is significant in terms of what it means for Iran's view of their own security, because that force they had counted on. And look, Lebanese Hezbollah, Nasrallah was actually a pretty cagey strategist. He would never have come into the fight on a large scale because Iran told him to. My theory all along was Lebanese Hezbollah would come in for 3 reasons. One, if they saw the opportunity overall, if they saw the opportunity for strategic success, which is the destruction of the state of Israel, which was his goal. But there were 3 conditions. One was Israel got so bogged down, say in Gaza or the West Bank or somewhere, that the defenses in the north were weakened. That condition has not obtained. Second one was there was such political paralysis in Israel that they'd be unable to decide on a response. Despite what's going on in Israel, there's no political paralysis on this issue. And the third thing is Israel would be so isolated on the world stage that there would be no support for them. Certainly there's been increasing isolation of Israel, not from the United States. So none of those 3 conditions have met. That's why Nasrallah did not come into I would argue, contrary to what people are writing, he did not come into the fight in support of Hamas on any scale. Instead, it was minor attacks across the border. If he had come in against Israel, he could have put 200 weapons an hour into downtown Tel Aviv. The Israelis would have intercepted most of those, probably not all of them. He chose not to do that. Instead, what he chose to do was display enough support to satisfy honor and no more. But what he found, though, was as his attacks developed, people in Israel moved south. You got 80,000 citizens that have been placed to the south. The pressure grows on the Israeli government to allow these people to return home. But again, I don't think that central to Nasrallah's calculation was not what was going on in Gaza. It was other reasons, the reasons I've just discussed, that actually prompted him to carry on this low-level conflict. So now, because they could never find a way to stop those northern attacks, Israel went north when they're in the process of clearing, whatever that's going to mean. I suspect that's going to be a bloody, bloody fight. There are going to be high casualties on both sides of that fight going forward. And so that's a significant problem. So, but the effect of that is that it further isolates Iran, which is why I would tell you today, right now, Iran is as weak as they have ever been on the stage in the region. Because they have very few ways to get at Israel right now. They can regenerate this attack. It's going to have about the same results. Israel, on the other hand, and we'll see what they do here over there, they can do about what they want inside Iran. And I'll just leave it there. We can talk in more detail about it. But the last part of the question, so what about Hamas? So Israel has conducted, they have achieved military defeat of Hamas. They have not destroyed Hamas. Hamas is still functioning politically and at a low level militarily. Obviously, their sense of proportionality, Israeli sense of proportionality for casualties is very high. I'm intimately familiar with the law of armed conflict. I know what it means. The law of armed conflict does not say that innocent people are not going to die in combat. It says that their deaths should be proportionate to the means gained. The Israelis use the same software, the same analysis that we do. Their calculation of what they're willing to accept is probably different than ours, but I can't say what ours would be under those circumstances because we haven't been in those circumstances. The last part of the question is good. I do believe that certainly one could reasonably surmise that some of these tactics are going to grow more terrorist. I think that's a reasonable observation, which takes you to the fact that you need a plan for a day after there. And so I am an unabashed two-state solution person. I have said that for as long as I've been around. My friends in Israel laugh at me when I make that point. They say you don't understand the complexities. I may not understand all the complexities, but I do know unless we come to some solution where there's going to be some form of sovereignty and quality of life in these areas, then you're going to fight forever. And even the Israelis don't want to fight forever. Hamas wants to fight forever. The Israelis ultimately aren't going to want to fight forever. So it's a difficult situation that they have right now, and you've got to imagine, you've got to go forward in time when you do strategic planning, envision the solution that you want, then backward plan from there to get there.
And there's so much anger and so much pain across the Arab world amongst people who are just watching everything unfold in Gaza and now in Lebanon, that radicalization is what worries a lot of the governments in the region who are key U.S. allies as well. I want to invite others from our audience here. David Ottaway.
Is this on?
Yes, it is. If it's green, yeah.
General, I wanted to turn your attention to Yemen and the Red Sea and our efforts to establish a deterrence to protect international shipping there. We do have a task force. The Europeans set up a task force, and they have not proved sufficiently effective to deter the Houthis from continuing to hit ships. In fact, in the last this week, they've hit 4 more ships. How do you deal with the Houthis to establish deterrence?
Sure. So the Houthis came to power in 2014, coup against the government of Yemen, fought a bloody and successful war against Saudi Arabia, fought a bloody and successful war against UAE to maintain a fraction of the state, fraction of the country under their control. They are true believers. I would argue they're the most radical, really, of all the Iranian proxy groups across the region. You know, fundamental to their philosophy on their flag is death to Israel, death to the United States. So these guys are all in. Yeah. And they, of all the Iranian proxy groups across the region, they're the only one that's really come in full-throated for support of Hamas. And they've done everything they can. But here's the other interesting thing about the Houthis. They are great aeronautical engineers. They're good. And what Iran does is Iran sends them weapons either by dhows, some of which we intercept, some of which we don't, or or goes across Oman. So they get some number of weapons, not a lot of weapons, but some number of weapons, and they get some intelligence support from Iran. But then they take those weapons and they modify them, and they make them much better. I mean, they are very good engineers. So they actually want to attack Israel. The problem is Israel's a long way from Yemen. So you can generate 1 or 2 missiles in a strike. That's not going to bother the Israelis. They're going to be able to intercept those missiles. So when the Houthis look about for a way to create pressure, direct strikes on Israel, not particularly productive. They do it, but it's not particularly productive. But what you can do, of course, is you can close the Bab el-Mandeb. If you close the Bab el-Mandeb, you close the Suez Canal, you put enormous stress on world commerce, unless you're Chinese. Enormous stress on world commerce, and they have done that. And so we have said, as a matter of national policy and our national security strategy and our national defense strategy, that we won't tolerate the closure of choke points like this. And we said we're going to open it, not based on any relationship with Israel, but rather based on the United States' position as a global maritime power. And we have, of course, failed completely in that task. And here's why. The political will to execute this is not there. The military capability is there to do one of two things. Either to inflict enough pain on the Houthis so they stop, or to take so much away that they cannot continue. Either of those missions is within our capability. We have destroyers down there. We have aircraft carrier down there. We have land-based aviation down there. We have all sorts of things down there that could impose very, very, very high costs on the Houthis, and we have chosen not to do that. And so as a result, the Bab el-Mandeb stays closed. The Suez Canal is effectively closed. And again, unless you're sailing in a Chinese bottom, you're not going to be able to go through. So China's chipping away and increasing its share of the world market. It works for them. The Russians are trying to get in on that deal too. But I would come back to the simple thing: there's no political will to solve this problem. The problem is solvable from a military perspective. I know and understand the problem. We can do this. We have chosen not to do it. And one last point: the Europeans do have a task force down there. Only the United States has these capabilities. The Europeans will be in. They can do a lot to help us, but this is a problem that requires only the resources of the United States. Great question. Thanks for. I'd forgotten to mention that. Thanks for asking that question.
Thank you. Any more questions here before I turn to online? Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, good morning, General. Thank you so much for coming and speaking with us today. My name is Rory Dixon. I'm a student up at Georgetown University and an intern with the Middle East program. And I was wondering what you would ascribe to the rise of ISIS in the region and how you would assess the U.S.'s effectiveness militarily post-Iraq in that region.
Sure. So ISIS arose from underlying conditions where largely Sunni populations were terribly treated. Like most of these things, that was the underlying cause that gave rise to it. We have largely not actually fixed that problem, so we should not expect ISIS to go away. But the long-term solution for ISIS, the United States, and I was the director of the Joint Staff when we crafted this plan, was that we ultimately wanted to be able to pull back. You wanted local security organizations in sovereign states to be able to keep enough pressure on ISIS so they couldn't regenerate enough to conduct external attacks on the United States, attacks on other nations. So, we're approaching that point actually with Iraq. So when we talk about the drawdown in Iraq, I'm not particularly concerned about that. We'll see how it plays out over the next year or so as we begin to draw our forces down. I'm more concerned about what's happening in eastern Syria, where unless we stay in eastern Syria, ISIS is going to come back. If we were to pull out, several things would happen. First, there'd be a humanitarian catastrophe in the displaced persons camps that are there. Second, the prisons that are there with about 10,000 hardened fighters, at least 1,000 of which are very, very high threat to us, they'd be released. So significant problems could arise if that happened. But our long-term goal always has been, you don't want U.S. forces out there doing this. We want to be out. We want to prevent the connective tissue, is how we would call it, from growing from these regions. Because the theory is this: if you're in the Euphrates River Valley and you want to attack Detroit, it's hard to do that if you're worried about surviving the night. Which is why what is happening in Afghanistan should concern us all, because ISIS is gathering strength in Afghanistan. It is going to renew itself there, and eventually, as the Russians learned south of Moscow a few months ago, we're going to pay a steep price for that. Great question. Thank you.
Thank you. Rob Litvak, or Senior Vice President here at the Wilson Center.
For this excellent presentation. Question, where you highlighted Iran as sort of a regional hegemon, it's not going away. Israel is reportedly on the cusp of a major response to the missile attack the other day. Can you just describe, like, how could this affect Iran's nuclear intentions?
Sure.
It's not the Manhattan Project, it's had a threshold capability. President Biden has explicitly asked the Israelis not to strike the nuclear infrastructure, which could have various consequences. Could you just play that one out and see that the nuclear dimension in Iran figuring in the current Israel-Iran crisis?
Sure, certainly. So you're right. The initiative right now is with Israel. Maybe very soon, maybe very, very soon, they're going to strike Iran. The strike that Israel conducted following the 13 April strike was, I would argue, usually Israeli responses are disproportionately heavy. It's just a theory they have of how to respond. But they were very light-footed with that. But they did a couple of things. They demonstrated technological mastery. The Iranians unable to really figure out what happened. And it was clear we can come back and do more if we choose to do it. The attack that's probably going to happen in the next few hours or days is likely not going to demonstrate that, that light touch. It's going to be far heavier. Could they go after the nuclear program? They could certainly choose to do that. It's a large, complex target. We have plans to go after the nuclear program. I know how hard it is to do that. And so that would be of all the things you could do to Iran, with the possible exception of striking the supreme leader, probably the most escalatory of all options that you could select if you're an Israeli planner thinking about what are we going to do here. So the question is, how hard do you want to push Iran toward a nuclear weapon? And so if you strike the nuclear program, you're probably going to. The fact of the matter is, the fissile material can't be destroyed unless you use a nuclear weapon on it. Nobody's going to use a nuclear weapon on it. So the material is going to be there. It's just a question of getting it out eventually. And so you really, it's a different problem than existed 15 years ago. I first started studying it right now. So it's hard to take that program out. And the question that Israelis have got to ask themselves, and I'm sure they're asking themselves this question is, do we want to do something that will inevitably push Iran for a nuclear weapon? And I think striking the nuclear program would probably firm that conviction in the minds of Iranian leaders that they want to do that. So my advice would be not necessarily, I would avoid doing that. But the Israelis are going to make up their own minds on that. I think that would certainly push Iran to that end. You could probably do some other things in Iran that would hurt Iran a lot, not necessarily push them to the nuclear threshold. I go back to the point that I made, just a few minutes ago. The nation that's in the corner is Iran. They are in trouble. Their principal ally in the region's gone, ineffective for a while. Maybe it'll come back, maybe it won't. But they don't have a lot of options. They've launched their big Sunday punch, and it landed largely on air. And so they don't have a lot of options that they can. In fact, I would argue the attack of 2 days ago was born of desperation. They had to do something. They had no good choices. Do nothing and you look weak. Launch and you're probably going to look weak, because they know and understand, the effects of these, how effective these strikes are. Although the last point I would tell you, it's a phenomena of Iranian state behavior that they lie to themselves on a biblical scale about the effectiveness of their attacks. I'll just leave it there. Sometimes they don't even understand just how bad the attack was, how much of a failure it was, because they lie endemically to themselves in the military chain of command.
But their people make fun of that on social media very well. Because if you follow all the memes and cartoons, we have a picture. We have another question. Sorry, can you please introduce yourself? Thank you.
Sure. Greg Koblenz from George Mason University. Thank you for the talk, and I just want to pick up on a comment you made about deterrence as a short half-life, and I'm curious to what extent that's a function of the fact that it seems both the U.S. and Israel have exercised a lot of restraint after Iranian attacks that wind up being usually failures for one reason or another, and they don't result in large numbers of casualties or any fatalities, and as a result, the U.S. or Israel is very restrained, and the responder does not respond at all.
Right.
Even though the intent by Iran was to cause lots of damage. And so I'm curious to what, and if the Iranians are lying to themselves and they think they cause lots of damage, and yet there is no response. I'm just curious, in terms of restoring deterrence and maybe trying to get longer deterrence in effect, to what extent should the response be calibrated to Iran's intent, or to the extent that the results or the outcome of their attack?
So I think an Israeli would argue that, well, the last time they launched a big attack on us, we were very light in our response. So we sucked down another 200 missiles several months later. So probably doesn't work. That would be the response to that. I think that would be their characterization of it. I think you make a great point. In the region, turning the other cheek is typically not an effective technique. The guy this institute's named after, Woodrow Wilson, once said, "There's such a thing as a nation being too proud to fight." That is not nobody in the region ascribes to that particular philosophy, and so I think Israel is going to feel they have to respond significantly here. And look, I don't think they want a war with Iran, and I don't believe Iran wants a war with Israel, because it will not end well for Iran, most likely, if that occurs. And also, they know if they go to war with Israel, they face the possibility of going to war with the United States before it's all over. Who knows how it can develop? So I think you make. I really like your point. I think it's a great observation that sometimes we mirror image and take the win. As language that's been used, it's hard to take the win in the region. It's just hard for people to do that because it's seen as a sign of weakness. That's my nickel for what it's worth.
Thank you. Please go ahead, ma'am. Yeah. If you can kindly use the mic and introduce yourself. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Mika Hood-Boy. I work at USAID on strategic planning, and picking up on your point about various regional alliances. Maybe not today, but down the road, with Iran part of BRICS and connected with China and Russia in a way that they weren't before. BRICS is not all that it could be today, but in terms of Iran surviving over the long term with backing from Russia and China, where do you think that might be going?
So I think that's certainly, a possibility and a threat. I would argue, let's just take one relationship, Iran and Russia. In the long run, Russia is not going to be interested in a strong Iran for a lot of reasons. So, so right now what we see, Iran sending missiles to Russia, Russia undoubtedly sending crowd surveillance technologies and other stuff, and probably other military technical equipment to Iran. That's a transactional relationship. I don't think it's ever going to develop into a strategic relationship, because ultimately it's not in Russia's interest to do that. They worry about what Iran can do, going back hundreds of years now taking the long view of the game, not just the immediate tactical view of the game. But I think your point about BRICS is a reasonable one, and I think they will draw strength from it, and BRICS will draw strength from it if Iran comes in. Yes.
Thank you. So we have 3 more questions here, and we're running out of time. So I'm going to take the 3 questions quickly and then have you respond. Could you kindly start, and then those of you who don't have mics in front, if you can also come to the mic.
Yeah, hi, my name is Ryan Ujadian. I'm a student at Howard and intern here at the Wilson Center. So Iran's Supreme Leader is currently 85 years old. There's a high possibility that he passes away in the next few years. A leading contender to succeed him is his son, Mojtaba. Do you foresee any changes in Iran's strategy in the region to U.S. interests?
Okay, let's take 2 more.
Megan?
Yeah, please, and then right here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, General. Megan Beaudet from the Kurdish Peace Institute. So you talked a lot about underlying causes and political solutions in Palestine, as well as with the ISIS issue. You also mentioned the importance of that U.S. presence and preventing an ISIS resurgence in northeast Syria. I just spent the summer out in northeast Syria, the Kurdistan region of Iraq, and one thing that has contributed to a lot of that instability there is the ongoing conflict between Turkey and various Kurdish groups. So I'm wondering what you see as the role of more diplomacy and political solutions in getting to some kind of political settlement with Turkey and various Kurdish entities in the region is in achieving those U.S. goals, particularly when we look at the fact that part of what you could argue allowed the U.S. to start supporting the YPG in 2014 was the fact that the Turks and the YPG and the Turks and the PKK were in a peace process and not attacking each other. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you. And one more right here. Thank you.
My name is Mattis. I work as an intern for the Austrian Embassy for the military attaché of Austria. Thanks a lot for the presentation, obviously. I was wondering, you were saying that the military program, the nuclear program of Iran, that the Iranians don't want to have a nuclear weapon, but they want the ability to make a nuclear weapon because this allows them to basically edge out concessions from the West. And so I was wondering that this kind of puts us into like a political deadlock position, because even if we accepted that this is what they're going to do, we can't stop giving them concessions for this, for basically for decreasing their nuclear capabilities, because if we did, they would say, okay, whatever, then we're just going to make a nuclear weapon, and we would arguably be in a worse position. So I was wondering, like, what's your opinion on that, and whether or not you have an idea how to, work around this deadlock position?
General, can we take one more?
Absolutely.
Okay, go ahead. Yes, go ahead. You just need to press it.
Thank you very much. General McKenzie, forgive me if my question does not taste good. My name is Majid Fani, and I'm Iranian American. And I have this understanding that your strike on General Qassem Soleimani was due to the command of former President Trump. Is that right?
That's correct.
So, as a pride man and honorable man, a general who has devoted his life for the benefit of living of Americans as good citizens of the world, how do you see this following of the order of President Trump, who was not and is not seen as a mentally and health-wise reasonable person, while, for example, his former foreign minister Rick Tillerson said he is a effing moron, and who asked, for example, the governor of Georgia to make up like 5,600 votes, declare it as a fraud, and then leave it to me. Or when he ordered the attack of General Qassem Soleimani, he was saying we have report of imminent attack to 4 U.S. embassy, and the former defense minister, General Sper, I guess, he said, no, we didn't have such a news, and he made up this. And under these conditions, you followed the order of killing a man who was a guest of Iraq, and the U.S. forces were not in Iraq based on the invitation, but just the lies that General Colin Powell was regretting, that they said weapons of mass destruction are here and we are there for so forth.
Thank you. So you have
Sure.
4 questions.
So I'll actually talk about Qassem Soleimani first. I saw the intelligence. There was clear intelligence that he was planning to kill Americans and be involved in attacks on Americans. President Trump was correctly elected. It was a constitutionally appropriate order. I followed it. I didn't lose any sleep over it. I haven't lost any sleep over it any night since. It was the right decision then. It's the right decision now. You can have your opinion. You're welcome to it. That's my opinion. Supreme Leader question. I don't think there'd be a lot of policy changes, because whoever becomes the Supreme Leader is going to be vetted by the IRGC. Could be his son. Raisi could have been the guy, except he made the mistake of getting into an Iranian helicopter. So that was, I don't think there'll be any change. If anything, it would go further to the right, I think. But, and the Supreme Leader has been dying for 20 years. We should just remember that. He's been around. He could be around for quite a while yet. And he actually looks reasonably healthy when you see him. So I think we should remember that. The Kurdish question, look, that's a very difficult question. Here's the problem. In relations between states, when they rub up against each other, typically it's the non-state entities that pay. And the Kurds are a non-state entity up there up in Syria, Syria and in Iraq as well. They don't have an particularly independent status, so they're going to be at grave risk. And, of course, we have an Article 5 relationship with Turkey that's very important to us. And so that actually makes it even more complex. Of course, the guy that knows more about this than anybody alive is right
I
here
knew
to
this
my
was
left.
coming.
So
Listen to the general.
But, look, I take your point. I would argue that it's important for us to maintain that relationship, to work it both inside Iraq, where there are unique challenges, and work it inside Syria as well, where there are even more challenges ultimately to the existence of the Kurds there. So I don't have a great answer for that. I know that, if we were to leave, I think a number of bad things would happen up there, and that's why I've argued that we need to stay there. I don't know what President Harris or President Trump would do. I don't have any idea how they might handle that when they come into office.
Thank you. Well, we have run out of time, and I want to thank you so much for your time today, General McKenzie, and for being very candid, and for the book that you wrote, and for all the reflections and your honesty about your experience. So thank you again.
Thank you very much.
Of course,
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you.